The meeting ended the way most meetings do. Quiet nods, a few satisfied expressions, people gathering their laptops like something productive had just happened. Ethan walked out with the rest of the team, mentally replaying the conversation. He felt good, clear, like he had contributed something valuable. The idea they agreed on, it made sense, logical, efficient. It even felt like it came from him, or at least partly from him. That's what stayed in his mind as he walked down the hallway. That was solid. That was my input. But a few steps later, something slowed him down. Not physically, but mentally. A slight hesitation. The kind that doesn't come from doubt, but from something not aligning perfectly. He stopped near the glass wall, looking out without really seeing anything. And then the thought surfaced, quiet but sharp. Did I actually come up with that, or was I led there? He replayed it again, the conversation, the timing, the way certain questions were asked, the way the discussion shifted without anyone noticing. And suddenly, that clarity he felt earlier didn't feel like his own anymore. Across the room, Daniel stood near the exit, exactly where he usually was, still, observing. He didn't look at Ethan, but it was clear he already knew what Ethan was starting to realize. And in that moment, something subtle but unsettling settled into Ethan's awareness. The most powerful manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation, because if it did, you would resist it. Ethan didn't say anything to anyone about it, but his mind stayed on that meeting longer than it should have. Not because something went wrong, but because nothing looked wrong. There was no argument, no pressure, no dominant personality forcing a direction. Everyone spoke freely, ideas were exchanged, options were considered. It looked like a perfect example of collaborative decision-making, and yet the outcome felt too aligned, too clean, too directed. He sat at his desk later, replaying the sequence again. The conversation hadn't been random. It had a flow, a structure, but it was invisible in real time. One question led to another. One idea framed the next. Certain options were explored more deeply, others quietly ignored. And no one noticed, not even him. That was the unsettling part. No one was forced, but everyone moved in the same direction. Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression tightening just a bit. That wasn't discussion, that was guidance. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. There was no manipulation in the obvious sense, no lies, no pressure, no control, just subtle influence, the kind that doesn't trigger resistance because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like choice. Ethan had changed over the past few weeks. He no longer reacted blindly to people. He understood emotional manipulation better now. He could see patterns in behavior, control, chaos, validation loops. But this was different. There was no emotional hook, no tension, no visible dominance, and that made it harder to detect because everything felt normal, smooth, even fair. That's what confused him. If there's no pressure, how is there control? That question stayed in his mind as he moved through the day. He started observing conversations more closely, not just what was said, but how it was said, the timing, the order, the framing, and slowly something began to emerge. Influence doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from direction, invisible direction, the kind you don't notice because you think you're still choosing freely. Ethan realized something uncomfortable. I've been watching behavior, but not structure. And that's where this type of control lived, not in what people do, but in how situations are shaped before you even respond. A few days later, Ethan started paying attention to one specific person in the team, a senior strategist who rarely stood out in obvious ways. He wasn't the loudest in meetings, not the most charismatic, not the most dominant. In fact, if you weren't paying attention, you could easily overlook him. But Ethan wasn't looking at surface anymore. He was watching patterns, and this man's presence had a pattern. He didn't push ideas, he introduced them, lightly,
almost casually. Then he stepped back, letting others pick them up. He asked questions, but not random ones, questions that guided thinking in a specific direction. He rarely disagreed directly. Instead, he reframed conversations so that disagreement dissolved on its own. It was subtle, clean, almost invisible, and yet the outcomes consistently aligned with his initial direction.
Ethan watched one meeting closely. The same pattern again. A suggestion placed early, a few guiding questions, silence at the right moments, and slowly the entire discussion moved toward a conclusion that felt collective. But it wasn't. It had been shaped from the beginning, and no one noticed. Ethan felt it clearly now. Not confusion, not discomfort, something sharper. He doesn't control people, he controls decisions. And that realization changed everything. Because controlling people creates resistance, but controlling decisions feels like freedom. Ethan didn't approach Daniel this time. He didn't need to. The pattern was already forming in his mind, but something about it still felt incomplete, as if he was seeing the surface clearly, but not the full depth beneath it. Daniel stood near the same spot, as if nothing around him had ever changed. Ethan stopped beside him, not speaking, just thinking. And without turning, Daniel spoke in that same calm, controlled tone. Some people don't control people. A slight pause. They control decisions. Ethan didn't respond, but the sentence landed immediately, because it explained everything he had been trying to understand. The strategist wasn't dominating conversations, he wasn't forcing outcomes, he wasn't even trying to be noticed, and yet outcomes kept aligning in his favor. That wasn't influence in the usual sense, that was something deeper, more structured, more precise. He's not part of the conversation, he's shaping it, Ethan realized. And for the first time, he saw the difference between visible authority and invisible control. One demands attention, the other operates without needing it. Most people think manipulation looks like pressure, persuasion, force, but what Ethan was seeing didn't match that at all. There was no resistance in these interactions because nothing felt imposed. That was the key. This wasn't about controlling behavior directly. It was about shaping the environment in which decisions were made. And once the environment is shaped, the outcome follows naturally. This is what defines Machiavellian thinking. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic, long-term, detached. It's not about dominating people, it's about understanding how people think, then designing situations that guide those thoughts toward a specific result. The strategist didn't need to convince anyone, he just needed to structure the conversation in a way where the right conclusion felt obvious, and once that happened, people would defend that conclusion as their own. Ethan leaned back in his chair later, the realization settling deeper. This isn't manipulation in action, this is manipulation in design. And design is harder to see, because by the time you notice it, the outcome has already been decided. The more Ethan observed, the more he understood that this wasn't random skill. It was a cognitive pattern, a way of thinking. Machiavellian individuals don't react to situations the way most people do. They don't get pulled into the moment. They stay slightly outside of it, watching, calculating, anticipating. Their focus isn't on what's happening now, but what will happen next, and how to influence that before it unfolds. Ethan noticed how the strategist rarely spoke early in conversations. He waited, let others reveal their thoughts, their biases, their preferences, and once enough information was visible, he stepped in, not to dominate, but to guide. A question here, a slight reframe there, just enough to redirect the flow. It looked effortless, but it wasn't. It was controlled, intentional, built on understanding how people process information and make decisions. They don't react to the moment, they design it, Ethan thought. And that line stayed with him, because it explained why everything felt so smooth. Nothing was forced, everything was pre-shaped.
There was another layer Ethan couldn't ignore. The strategist never seemed emotionally invested in any discussion, not in the way others were. There was no attachment to being right, no visible frustration when challenged, no need for validation, and that absence created clarity. Because emotions often distort judgment. They create urgency, bias, reaction. But without that interference, decisions become cleaner, more calculated. He compared it to his own behavior. Even now, he still felt subtle pulls, wanting to be heard, to be right, to be aligned. Those were normal human instincts, but they also created openings that someone like this could use. The strategist didn't have those openings, or if he did, he didn't show them, and that made him harder to influence in return.
No emotion, no friction, Ethan realized. And without friction, movement becomes easier to control. That was the advantage. Not intelligence alone, but detachment. The ability to stay outside emotional noise and operate purely on outcome. And once you understand that, you start to see how decisions can be shaped long before they are made. Once Ethan understood the structure, the absence of visibility started to feel intentional. The strategist never occupied the center of attention. He didn't need to. While others spoke more, explained more, tried to be heard, he stayed just outside that space, close enough to influence, far enough to avoid scrutiny. And that positioning made him difficult to track, because people only analyze what stands out, and he never did. Ethan began to notice something precise. The strategist rarely initiated direct opinions. Instead, he shaped the path that led others to those opinions. A slight emphasis on one option, a quiet dismissal of another, a question that narrowed the field without anyone realizing it had been narrowed. It was clean, efficient, almost invisible. If you notice him, he's already moved past the point of influence, Ethan thought, because the real work had already been done before anyone thought to question it. This wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about control in the obvious sense. It was about remaining unseen while still determining outcomes. And that, Ethan realized, was a different level of power, one that didn't need recognition because it didn't rely on it. A few days later, another meeting confirmed everything. Ethan walked in already aware, already watching for patterns instead of words. The discussion started normally, ideas being shared, options being debated, nothing unusual on the surface. But this time, Ethan didn't focus on what was being said. He focused on how the conversation was moving. The strategist spoke early, but only briefly. He introduced a perspective, light, almost casual. Then he stepped back. Others picked it up, expanded on it, unknowingly reinforcing it. As the conversation progressed, he asked a few questions, not random questions, targeted ones. Questions that guided attention toward specific details while ignoring others. And slowly, without resistance, the discussion began to align. Ethan could see it now. The decision wasn't being made at the end of the meeting. It was being shaped from the beginning. Each step narrowed the direction. Each contribution felt independent, but it wasn't. It was connected, structured, designed. And when the final conclusion was reached, everyone agreed, not because they were convinced, but because they had been guided there. This isn't collaboration, Ethan realized. This is architecture. What made it effective wasn't force, it was freedom, or at least the appearance of it. Everyone in the room felt like they had a voice, like they were contributing, like they were choosing the outcome together. And that feeling removed resistance completely, because people don't fight what they believe they've chosen. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching the room settle into agreement. No tension, no disagreement left unresolved, just quiet acceptance. But now he could see the structure behind it. The options had been framed, the direction had been limited. Certain paths were explored more deeply, others were never fully considered, and all of it happened without anyone noticing the constraints. I wasn't deciding, Ethan thought. I was moving within a path that was already set, and that realization changed how he viewed every decision around him,
because once the path is shaped, the choice becomes predictable, and predictability is what makes control possible. The impact didn't hit immediately. It came later, when the consequences of that decision started to unfold. Ethan noticed who benefited most from it. Not the team, not the broader goal. The strategist, indirectly of course. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be pointed out as manipulation, but the alignment was clear once you looked closely enough. Ethan felt a quiet frustration build, not outward but internal, not because he had been forced into something, but because he hadn't seen it happening. That was the difference. There was no pressure to resist, no signal to question, just a smooth path that led exactly where it was designed to lead. And that's when the deeper realization settled in. The most effective control doesn't trigger awareness, because awareness creates resistance, and resistance breaks control. But here, there was none, not until it was already done. Ethan looked across the room, his expression calm but sharper now. No force, no conflict, just influence. And that made it harder to fight, because you can't resist something you don't even realize is there.
Ethan didn't confront anyone. He didn't question the decision. Instead, he carried the realization with him, letting it settle deeper. That evening, as the office thinned out, he found himself standing near Daniel again. There was no need to explain what had happened. Daniel had already seen it. He always did. After a few seconds of silence, Daniel spoke, his tone steady, almost detached. The smartest manipulation, he paused briefly, removes resistance. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to, because that was exactly what had happened. There was nothing to push against, no pressure to reject, no force to question. The decision had felt natural, logical, even collaborative. And that's why it worked, because resistance never activated. And without resistance, there was nothing to break the flow. Ethan stared ahead, the weight of that realization settling in. I didn't agree because it was right. I agreed because it was structured that way. And that difference changed everything. The deeper Ethan went into it, the more he understood why this kind of manipulation is so effective. Humans are wired to resist control, but only when they feel controlled. The moment pressure is visible, the mind reacts. It questions, pushes back, defends autonomy. But when control is subtle, when it feels like suggestion instead of force, the brain doesn't activate that defense. It accepts. It flows with it. That's the advantage Machiavellian thinkers operate on. They don't trigger your defenses, they move around them. They don't tell you what to do, they guide how you think. And once your thinking is guided, your decisions follow automatically. Ethan leaned back in his chair later, the idea becoming clearer. People don't resist direction, they resist domination. And if there's no domination, there's nothing to resist. That's why it works so cleanly, because it aligns with how the mind naturally operates. Now that Ethan knew what to look for, the patterns started appearing everywhere, not just with the strategist, but in smaller interactions too. The framing of options, the timing of information, the way certain details were emphasized while others were quietly ignored. It wasn't random, it was structured. Every conversation had a flow, and that flow could be shaped. Ethan noticed how questions were rarely neutral. They pointed somewhere. What if we focused more on this direction? Wouldn't that create a better outcome? Each question narrowed the field, guided attention, reduced alternatives. And because they were questions, not statements, they felt harmless, collaborative, but they weren't neutral. They were directional. This isn't about convincing people, Ethan thought. It's about limiting what they consider. And once the range of consideration is limited, the outcome becomes predictable. That's when it clicked fully. Control doesn't require force, it requires structure. And structure, when done well, is invisible. At its core, Ethan realized this wasn't about personality, it was about cognition.
Machiavellian individuals don't rely on emotional connection or dominance. They rely on understanding how decisions are formed. They read patterns in thinking, anticipate reactions, and design interactions accordingly. It's not emotional empathy, it's cognitive mapping. They don't feel what you feel, they understand how you decide. That's what makes it effective. Because once you understand decision patterns, you don't need to control behavior directly. You control the process that leads to behavior. Ethan let that settle in, his thoughts quieter now, but sharper. They don't change people, they change the path people walk on. And once the path is set, people move forward naturally, believing they chose it themselves. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just observing manipulation, he was understanding the system behind it. And that understanding was the beginning of something else. Not reaction, not resistance, something more controlled. Ethan didn't confront the strategist. He didn't expose anything. That would have been the old way, reactive, direct, predictable. Instead, he changed something smaller, but more important. He slowed down, not physically, but mentally. In conversations, he stopped responding immediately. He let questions sit for a moment, let silence exist, and in that silence, something new appeared. Space. Space to think, space to see the structure forming before stepping into it. The next time a discussion started moving in a familiar direction, Ethan didn't follow automatically. He paused, looked at the framing, looked at what options were being emphasized and which ones weren't. And then, instead of agreeing or resisting, he asked a neutral question. What are we not considering here? The room shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough, because that question didn't oppose the flow, it disrupted it. It opened space outside the path that had been quietly set.
Ethan felt it immediately. The structure wasn't as smooth anymore. The direction wasn't as tight. And for the first time, the outcome wasn't predetermined. You don't break control by fighting it, he thought. You break it by stepping outside the path. The real moment came a few days later. Another meeting, same structure, same strategist, same pattern beginning to form. Ethan recognized it early now, the initial framing, the guiding questions, the narrowing of options. But this time, he didn't wait until the end. He stepped in early, not aggressively, not emotionally, just precisely. As the conversation started aligning, Ethan spoke, calm, steady. Before we move forward, I think we're overlooking an alternative approach. No tension, no challenge in his tone, just a statement, then silence, the kind of silence that forces attention without demanding it. The strategist looked at him briefly, not surprised, but aware. The flow had been interrupted, not broken completely, but disrupted enough to change direction. The conversation opened again, new ideas entered, the path widened, and just like that, the structure lost its tight control. Ethan didn't push further. He didn't try to dominate the discussion. He didn't need to, because the goal wasn't to control, it was to remove invisible control. And once the structure loosened, people started thinking again, independently. For the first time, Ethan wasn't moving within the system. He was observing it and stepping outside it. That moment stayed with Ethan long after the meeting ended, not because he had won anything, but because he had seen something clearly. Power isn't always about who speaks the most or who dominates the room. Sometimes it's about who shapes the path others walk without them realizing it. And once that path is broken, the power shifts instantly. Ethan understood it now on a deeper level. Most people don't lose control because someone forces them. They lose it because they don't see the structure guiding their decisions. They follow the path, believing they chose it, and that belief is what makes the system so effective. Power isn't forcing people, Ethan thought. It's making their choices predictable. And once choices become predictable, outcomes can be designed.
That was the real mechanism, not emotion, not dominance, structure, invisible structure. That evening, as the office emptied again, Ethan walked out with the same quiet control he had developed over time. No rush, no overthinking, just awareness. Daniel was near the exit, as always, still, observant, unchanged. They walked side by side for a few seconds in silence before Daniel spoke. "The most dangerous control," he said calmly, "feels like freedom." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to, because now he understood exactly what that meant. Not intellectually, but experientially. He had felt it, lived it, seen how easily a decision could feel like his while being shaped by something else. Outside, the air felt clearer, not because anything had changed externally, but because his perception had. He wasn't reacting blindly anymore. He wasn't stepping into every path that was presented to him. He was seeing the structure before entering it. And as he walked forward, one final thought settled in, quiet, precise, and permanent. The moment you see the path, you stop being predictable. And when you stop being predictable, control has nowhere to attach. If this made you see something you couldn't see before, subscribe, because most people never notice the patterns that are controlling them.